A man named Lewis who was on the phone with his girlfriend, Venna. Lewis, who had been previously lived outside the city, took some time off to meet Venna. However, Lewis said that he had to first pick up his brother who had just been released from prison. The journey began on the same day that Lewis bought a second-hand car that he had been dreaming of for a year. He had to deal with several police officers along his way as a result of his excessive speed. When he arrived at the police station, he immediately settled an issue with his driver's license as well as his car's registration, and at the same time he went to pick up his elder brother, Fuller. Shortly after, Fuller, who had just been released, still continued to behave as what he did before by purchasing a CB radio and plugging it into Lewis's car. For those who don't know what this radio is, CB radio or citizen band radio is a radio that allows two-way communication between individuals. In most countries, truck drivers usually use this radio to get information about weather or location. However, they had no idea that big problems would soon strike them both as a result of this newly installed radio.
It's gonna rain hard tonight. Keeps everybody inside.
Fuller even attempted to prank one of the truck drivers, named Rusty Nail. Fuller told Lewis to disguise himself as a woman, which he did as Candy Cane.
Pretending the person that I'm talking to is right next to me.
At first, the two of them just wanted to do it for fun while going through a long journey. But things got worse when Rusty Nail actually believed that Candy Cane really had a crush on him. Furthermore, he hadn't felt a woman's love in a long time. After hearing Candy Cane's flirtation, which is getting more intense, Fuller then made a plan to prank this guy by inviting him to a motel where they would be staying for one night. When Fuller wanted to make a reservation, he couldn't check in right away as he had to wait for a guy who was yelling at the receptionist. After that, Fuller got back into the car and told Lewis to continue seducing Rusty Nail. As a result, Lewis invited the guy to come to the Lone Star Motel, where they would meet each other in room number 17. But the room number was not theirs. Instead, it was the room number of a businessman whom Fuller had previously seen at the reception. Even worse, Rusty Nail still tried to come to the hotel even though it was pouring outside. Well, assuming that their prank had been succeeded, Lewis and Fuller continued to eavesdrop on the next room. In fact, they were now staying at the motel's room number 18. But the situation immediately became tense when they didn't hear any laughter at that time, but instead just heard the sound of someone getting beaten. Lewis then called one of the hotel receptionists, but the receptionist just said that the condition in the next room was fine, and there was no one staying there. In the morning, Lewis, who had just woken up, was starting to get confused when he saw the police were already in the motel complex. It is not known exactly what happened, but the police said they found a man slumped in the middle of the road. And after finding out his identity, it turned out that the man was the occupant of room number 17. Well, it's clear that yesterday night's prank was no longer a joke, but had turned into a tragedy for everyone. This included a businessman who had to be in a coma at the time, when Rusty Nail tore his jawbone. However, the cops will need to gather further evidence to determine whether these actions led to the truck driver. Fuller and Lewis then checked out of the motel and continued on their way to pick up Venna. But they didn't expect to find out that Rusty Nail was still looking for Candy Cane's figure in the middle of their journey. During the conversation, Rusty Nail said that he had been driving all day to find the candy cane that he loved. But Fuller still had no intention of apologizing to the guy, and instead hurled insults at Rusty Nail. As a consequence, the situation became even worse, once they found that the guy had been following them since the afternoon. At the same time, the car's gasoline supply was running short, therefore they needed to dodge him as fast as possible by making a sharp turn. Fortunately, there is a petrol station along the way, which Fuller took advantage to refuel the gas. Meanwhile, Lewis went inside the small store to call the cops and report that they were trapped at a petrol station. And it seems that Fuller saw a man who had just arrived at the location. The man made suspicious movements as he approached the mini market, while carrying a baseball bat with him. Lewis, who saw him, was forced to leave the mini market as soon as he spotted him. Following that, their suspicions was true when the mysterious truck driver was following them. Lewis had no other choice but to just break through any dark road until he didn't realize it was a dead road.
No.
Plus, the truck driver was already in the back of their car, and he rushed over to Lewis and Fuller. But unexpectedly, he only intended to return Lewis's ATM card, which he had left at the convenience store because he was in a rush. Regarding why he brought a baseball bat into the mini market, it turns out that the man only wanted to check the tire pressure. I thought their life would end in this place, but they were actually being chased by regular guy. After then, the situation began to calm down as the truck driver started to leave the place. However, they were surprised when the real Rusty Nail began to appear in front of them at that very moment. It was clear that he was really serious about pursuing Lewis and Fuller. So there wasn't much they could do at that point, other than dodge as fast as they could before they crash into a tree. In the end, they were unable to stop Rusty Nail since he intended to pin them with his jumbo vehicle. Fuller then tried to apologize at that very moment, and Rusty Nail ended up to go away from the place. After last night's incident, it looked that Lewis' car had just been repaired, and Fuller was no longer interested in playing with the car's CB radio. The following day, Lewis was finally able to meet Venna, who had been waiting for a few days. At this moment, they were also introduced to Venna's friend, Charlotte. But Charlotte can't go on vacation with them since she already has a date with another friend. Lewis and Fuller couldn't act weird anymore with Venna's presence, because they didn't tell her about what had happened to them before. Fuller, who thought that the situation had returned to normal, tried to invite Lewis and Venna to have a drink at a bar which is just close to their motel. Once they started to get drunk, Venna was harassed by several men who seemed to have bad intentions towards her. At that point, Lewis immediately appeared to beat that guys, and Fuller then invited them both to leave the place. When Lewis arrived at the motel, it seemed that he was tired and he fell asleep right away. Well, Fuller took this opportunity to approach Venna, who was alone in the room without Lewis noticing it, and he started flirting with Venna. At the same time, Lewis had to wake up from his sleep after he got a call from the hotel receptionist. And when the phone was picked up, the voice didn't come from the hotel receptionist, but from Rusty Nail. Lewis, who was panicked, went straight to Venna's room, and he didn't care anymore that his brother was alone with his girlfriend. But most importantly, Lewis managed to tell Fuller that Rusty Nail was starting to have an interest in his own girlfriend, Venna. They rushed out of the hotel when they realized what had happened, unsure of where they wanted to go at this late hour. But it turned out that Rusty Nail had also given them a code through a road sign, with the work look printed on it. Therefore, Fuller pulled over to the side of the road, and the three of them immediately got out of the car to check the rear trunk. It's not known exactly how, but Rusty Nail has put back a CB radio that Fuller had thrown away. He did it in order to communicate with them via the radio. Venna, on the other hand, had no idea of what was going on. But she started to understand once she heard the screams of his own friend, Charlotte. They immediately realized that Charlotte had been kidnapped by Rusty Nail. Plus, the three of them are prohibited from reporting that incident to the police. At this point, Fuller, Lewis and Venna were told to come to a rest stop, and follow his next directions, which he would explain later. This instruction turned out to be exclusively for Fuller and Lewis, who were told to enter one of the dining rooms completely naked this time. Rusty Nail seems to be attempting to offer a deterrent effect to both of them, by telling them how it feels to be embarrassed by others. Obviously, this action relates to Rusty Nail himself, who was embarrassed after previously entering the men's room, which is the businessman's room. It didn't stop there. The three of them were told to come again to a place that was far from the town. As can be seen, Rusty Nail chose to meet them in an area that is entirely surrounded by cornfields. At this point, they realized that Rusty Nail really did want to run them over with his big truck. After seeing that truck was speeding towards them, they immediately ran into the cornfields. They were forced to split from one another at this time, which would be an opportunity for Rusty Nail. In the end, Venna was kidnapped by that man, and Lewis's only car was found on fire after the incident. Fortunately, Fuller and Lewis were still able to hear one piece of information, which they were both directed to come to a hotel named Medford, and visit one of the hotel rooms numbered 17. They quickly left the cornfield and rushed to steal one of the parked cars there. After Fuller succeeded to steal the car, they began to search for the location of a motel that had been mentioned by the truck driver. On the other hand, it was seen that Venna was already in a room being held captive by that man. As we can see, Rusty Nail seemed to have planned something that would kill Venna in an instant. He even deliberately called the police saying that a crime had just taken place at the motel. A few minutes later, Lewis and Fuller had arrived at the hotel Rusty Nail had mentioned, but they found no one in room 17. We can see that Rusty Nail was apparently just wanted to repeat a prank that the two of them had done before. Moreover, the room number is also exactly the same, and Rusty Nail was in room number 18. Fuller then planned to enter the room through the back door secretly without the man's notice. However, the truck driver had already predicted Fuller's movements, and Fuller had to be thrown out of the room. Luckily, Fuller, who had seen Venna was being held captive while facing a shotgun, still had time to yell at Lewis not to open the door. As a result, Lewis didn't open the door as he heard it, but he did lose sight of Rusty Nail, who had escaped with his truck. Not long after that, the police arrived at the motel, where their arrival was greeted by the death of the hotel receptionist. The police officers had absolutely no idea that they were not allowed to open the door to room number 18. In this situation, Lewis began to panic because he still had to save Fuller, who was about to be hit by Rusty Nail. Luckily, this time Lewis was able to save Venna, who was almost shot at the time, as well as Fuller, whom he had left because he was desperate to save Venna. As a result, the truck driven by Rusty Nail directly crashed into the motel. In the end, the mysterious truck driver could no longer do anything, and it turned out that Charlotte was still alive. Following the incident, Lewis was informed by one of the officers that the culprit was a truck driver who worked for an ice cube manufacturing company. Of course, Fuller and Lewis were shocked by what they had just heard, especially since they knew that the man's ice cube truck had been struck by Rusty Nail in the past. And before the film ends, they could still hear Rusty Nail, who was asking about weather in the radio, by tuning into every channel available on the other truck's radio.